Welcome to Carrying Wayward, a supernatural podcast for fans who aren't ready to let go and newcomers to the series who are ready to jump in. I'm Drew Schulman.
And I'm Marie Vigourou. In this mini-sode, we'll channel our own angel radio to answer voicemails. Let's get this show on the road. Hello, everyone. Welcome back again. This is now our third Angel Radio episode. And we honestly really hope that you all like them. We're kind of recording these in short succession, and so we have no idea what the answer is going to be, but we really hope that you're going to like them. For those of you who might not know, we had some extra voicemails that people really took the time to send us, and we really wanted to honor that by answering them properly and in a bit of a more timely manner, just because we were starting to have a bit of a backlog. And also, like, so many of you have told us that you love listening to voicemails, and so we wanted to kind of find a forum that was appropriate for answering these voicemails, again, properly and with the care that they deserve. And so we figured that we would do that in order to kind of like continue this conversation during our hiatus.
And if you are feeling super inspired by one of our past episodes, or maybe at some point during this episode, feel free to write us a letter. Feel free to write us a letter and scan it and then email it to us, or type it up, or even better, record yourself and send it as a voicemail to @carryingwayward@gmail.com so we can eventually get to yours on a future episode or Angel Radio.
This has been such a fun experience for us. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but I know that it's been a really fun experience for me to answer these voicemails in short succession, just because like it's I always look forward to the voicemail segment of the podcast. And so to kind of like just be doing that is like kind of just like having cake for dinner. Like it really feels like just getting ice cream and just having ice cream for dinner or something. Like, so I'm very happy with this.
Now you have me craving ice cream.
This first voicemail is from Destiny.
Destiny writes, "Hello, Mary and Drew. I really love the podcast, and y'all definitely helped me continue watching after Bobby's death. My message is on the boys' coping mechanisms, and or lack of them, in particular Dean. I talked on the server about how the show, when it's trying to actually depict the grief the brothers go through, shows them going through it differently. Which makes sense since the person who they learned how to deal with their grief from, their father, was viewed differently between them during their developmental years. Dean, who idolized his father, sees him deal with grief by hunting the monster who killed their loved ones, and getting justice. We then see in the season after Dean loses not only Cass but Bobby, who was a father figure to Dean processing his grief and trauma like his father, hunting Dick, and obsessing over it to the point he doesn't think of anything else. Whereas Sam, who had a rockier relationship with his father, does the opposite. He saw his father ignore those still around to pursue the monsters, and decided to focus on the people instead. We see this in him asking about if they need to call anyone for Bobby, him helping the hunter's daughter, and him continuously reaching out to Dean, especially if when he sees him drinking and obsessing. So, I don't know why talk of Dean's grief is stuck in my head, but I keep expecting him to explode in rage or in any of his emotions. I keep thinking back to when he bottled his emotions up and ended up taking it out in his car in the earlier seasons, and how he tried to hide his grief and feelings until he cannot anymore and needs to either talk, fight, or do something reckless with his life. And I find it interesting that now that he's trying to find a way to deal with Cass's death, Bobby's death, and let's be honest, he never truly dealt with any of the other hunters' deaths like Alan or Rufus, and trying to talk or learn how to deal with the world is putting him back in a box. Like when he time travels, Elliot Ness basically tells him he's not being a real man and asking if everyone is as weak as him in the future, and to just deal with the death and move on. Or Frank, who definitely was trying to help, but the message of just put a smile on and continue, which let's also be honest is the only message Dean got interpreted from that at all, tells him to hide his emotions and not show any hint of his depression or grief. It's definitely a misogynist way of thinking, how men can't show emotions, or they aren't real men. We see at the end of the episode, Adventures in Babysitting, him try and put this to his mindset by smiling it all away, and even then, he can only really do it for a second before you see the thoughts come across his face. And then you see him fall back into his patterns of drinking and reckless endangerment. Someone who we saw sleep around in the beginning seasons would not forget to wrap it up and stay protected. The show is slowly showing him regress back to his bad coping mechanisms, and even if the show didn't mean it, because I can never tell if they intended to actually do something, it really helps illustrate that coping and dealing with pain isn't linear sometimes. You fall back into your bad habits to stay afloat, or to even feel anything. I was wondering about your take on their grief and how you think they'll move forward, or just their mental states and coping mechanisms. Sorry for the long rant, or if it didn't make any sense. Love the podcast so much.
Destiny, thank you so much for this, again, this lovely message. I mean, I think so much of this show is about grief. I think this show explores grief in so many ways. Again, especially if we look at the first 5 seasons. But I think this also continues, especially in season 7. Like, we see so much grief in season 7. Like, that was supposed to be kind of like sorry, so season 6 or season 7? Anyway, in those seasons, that was supposed to be the big reset where nobody comes back from those seasons, right? Like, where they're left to their own devices, the brothers, and they're kind of stuck losing everybody that they've ever known and loved. And something that you said about the way that the brothers observed their father grieving is kind of sticking in my head, especially this idea of the relationship between masculinity and expressing emotion, right? Because it's not so much that Dean can't feel grief, right? That's not the issue that people have with him, with him and his emotions. It's the way that he expresses them, right? So he's not allowed to show that he's grieving. He can grieve, but that's a private thing, right? You got to keep that inside. You can't show it. So it's the expression of the emotion that's pretty strictly forbidden from the kind of masculinity that we see in hunters' communities, right? Whether that's through John, through Frank, that's the kind of stuff that we see. And I guess obviously what I'm thinking about is the fact that masculinity or toxic masculinity is nothing if not just a hatred of everything feminine, because what it really looks to be is not feminine, right? So the reason why you can't express emotion as somebody who presents as a man, let's use the terms that toxic masculinity would like us to use, right? So as a man, the reason why you cannot express emotion is because that is associated with women. And if you do something that is associated with women, then therefore you must be a woman and therefore inferior, or you must be womanly and therefore inferior to this specific breed of man that is nothing like women, right? That distances themselves entirely from anything that could potentially be associated remotely with femininity. And I just cannot stop thinking about it, especially in a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Eric Kripke and his relationship with toxic masculinity. Obviously, I know that that the Frank storyline happens a little bit later, but just again, everything that we see in season 5 about him bottling up his emotions, really what he's doing is that he's trying not to express them. And something that I heard that I thought was really meaningful to me is this idea that healing or coping is expressing, right? So when you're not expressing the emotion that you're feeling, you're not healing, you're not coping, you're not moving forward. And so to deny Dean and to deny men in general this vital expression of emotions is is not doing anybody any favors, I don't think. It's definitely not doing any favors to Dean, because then what happens to him is that he tends to bottle, and then blow up. And I mean, that's something that we see a lot of men do in our lives, but also like on TV, right? Like the typical expression of men's like anger is like getting mad and like punching something, right? Because like the emotion is so intense that like you must hit something, because like you haven't actually expressed it in any other way before, right? So anyway, um again, not too sure why this is what's coming out for me when I'm reading this message, but this is what came out. So Destiny, thank you so much again for this lovely message.
I really wanted to grab onto something you said, which is the like, you're never sure if something was done intentionally by the show, like if it was what their intention was. Because I have two thoughts on that are one, another the kind of like double-edged blade of this is a point that you brought up that like I don't know if it was intentional, and it is the fact that we do see Dean regress. Like it isn't just some sort of magical, movie moment where like he learns to deal with his anger and then never gets angry again and everything's sunshine and rainbows for the rest of the series. Like, no, we see him hit a tipping point or get to a point where the coping skills he thought he could work without are no longer, doing it for him, and he does regress back to his anger and his drinking and his ways, and it makes him more human. Like, we all, I hope we all try our best to improve ourselves, but no matter, I know no one's perfect. You were gonna slip back. I mean, I feel like I'm quoting what I know from AA only from like movies and TV shows, but like just because you have a slip doesn't mean you have to start at zero again. You pick yourself up and you keep going. So yeah, Dean's gonna mess up. Dean's gonna have those toxic masculinity level outbursts that the show is known for. But it doesn't mean that the growing he has done previously is erased. It just means he needs to try again. He needs to pick himself back up and continue on his path to recovery. So again, was this them having a really intelligent conversation about the way people handle and cope with things? Or was it just, yeah, Dean gets angry at shit, let's have him be angry at this because it fits the story? I think I lean one way more than the other, but for the sake of us, like watching this together and learning from it and having conversations, I'm choosing to believe the better of the two for the sake of us as an audience.
Right. I mean, I think this is one of those cases where like it's two things can exist at once, in the sense that like it was probably not planned to be read as in detail as we are right now, and yet, and also, and we can, because it's there. Right. And so whether or not it was intentional doesn't really particularly matter to me anyway.
That's also a great way to view it, and I'm glad you brought it up. So thank you, and thank you, Destiny, for a lovely message. Next, we have a voicemail from Shay.
Hello, Caring Wayward. I'm yet again sending another voicemail. I am still pretty far behind in your series. I am up to season 5, episode 2. And I've rewatched the show quite a few times now, and happened to find your podcast interesting. I know you guys really enjoy Cass. And from the information that I've researched about Cass was not supposed to be a reoccurring character. Cass was supposed to be a one-shot character that saved Dean from hell, and that was it, which is why when Misha Collins took the acting deal, he gave Cass the really deep voice that he has. And you will find that during French Mistake, he has 2 different voices, his Cass voice and his Misha voice. And I find this really interesting, and figured you would find it really interesting as well, just because of the relationship that Cass has built with Dean. And with him becoming this reoccurring character, the show really pushed into Dean's bisexuality, rather than if they had kept Cass a one-shot character like they had originally planned. And that's all from the fan base. Like, the showrunners and everyone, especially Eric Kripke, wanted Cass as a one-off character. He was going to save Dean and he was going to go back to heaven. But the fan base went wild when Cass came. So the fact that he's such an important character through seasons 5, 6, and even up to season 15, like, not to spoil anything for Drew, but that ending with Cass was ridiculous. But yeah, thanks for listening to this. I just figured I'd share that little bit of information and hear your guys' take on the fact that Cass was not supposed to be a main character.
Shay, I love this. This is one. Don't worry. I know. I don't want to say what I know because I don't want to like get into like territory of like talking about it, but like I know the ending for Cass is not liked by anyone really. Like I've never seen anyone defend it. I'm sure they're out there, but I've never come across them, and I hope I never do. And I would like to go into it as blind as I can, so don't worry. I know there's an ending with Cass that is very difficult. But to go back to what this message was about, the idea that he was not meant to be a mainstay, it's so incredible, because to think of like what he has become, and to reflect on some other voicemails we've had in our past Angel Radio episodes, the idea that like some of these things that like we didn't know were going to happen or had to be like written in or changed, like how it affects the show, like how different would the ending be if it wasn't for Cass? Would there be a different queer love interest for Dean to lose? Would the barrier gay thing be as big a deal as it was without Cass? Like, these are all questions I can kind of like pose, but like don't really know the answers to, obviously. But I always find it so interesting when we find out about, like, I think we talked about it briefly in season 6 and 7, where Cass was like written out of the show, and like the fan response was like, no, bring him back. And they kind of had to like forcibly write him in. And like, even then it was like, he came back, he saved Sam, he's put in a hospital, we'll see what happens. And like, they had to like, not waste time, but like use up episode space to bring him back, to recover him and then fit him into the story. And like, it makes you wonder how many other shows or how many other things, even in Supernatural, we talked about Dean and Helen season 3 and now Cass, like how many things were supposed to be a mainstay and then weren't, or like Cass were not meant to stick around but did. Like, I would not be shocked to learn that Charlie was a one-off character, but because she was so popular, they kept inviting her back. Maybe she was meant to be there longer, maybe she wasn't, I don't know. Mary's nodding, which makes me think that maybe there is a little more to this.
No, she was supposed to be like a one-off. Yeah, for sure.
The interaction that we as fans get to have with shows, like, I know Mary did an amazing episode of Parasocial Relationships. Like, there is a level of like the community both with and versus the show running team and production side. And again, you have the money upstairs that gets to make decisions and can look at the audience and go, well, no, we have to pivot for them. And that may work for or against the showrunner and how they feel about their audience. We've talked about Supernatural and their perceived audience and the slights they've offered several times. But I think it is really interesting to like, it's a fun thought experiment, again, to think about what could have been versus what was. And, you know, I always love when those stories do come out and we get to go like, oh, well, here's the thing that actually like wasn't supposed to happen. Like, ooh, what does it mean? So thank you for bringing this up. It's a great like piece of knowledge to have. And yes, I feel like the gravelly voice was a really tough choice to make when you realize there was suddenly like, oh, I'm doing this for 10 more seasons. Shit.
Yeah, so first off, thank you so much, Shay, for this voicemail. We really appreciate it. Misha has spoken before about this, where he's like, you know, if I had known that Cass was going to be a recurring character, I would have definitely not given him that voice. He's like, that was just a choice that I made because I didn't think that this would be such a big part of my life, right? So I think that that's absolutely incredibly funny. And that brings me to talk about the reason why we know this information. And it's because of cons, particularly creation cons, right? So like all of the supernatural conventions that have happened over the years. And I I think that created an incredibly short feedback loop between the show creators and the audience, right? And so immediately people knew, people from the show knew how much the audience loved Cass, right? Because there was, especially at the time, Jared and Jensen were incredibly active on social media, or they were at least, interacting with people, like actually answering their tweets, right? And live tweeting and like, was that, was that at the time? And I think they might have been, when was Twitter? Oh my God. I'm like, when was Twitter? But anyway, like that might have been a bit later, but they were definitely involved with the fandom, like a lot closer, right? Because they weren't sure from year to year if they were going to get a renewal. And so, like one of the ways to engage audiences is to create those parasocial relationships and to encourage those parasocial relationships with them, right? That is a marketing strategy in order to make sure that your show gets renewed, which is an incredibly smart one because it works and it makes audiences feel good. And it, so it's a positive thing, but it is a mechanism that I do want to point out. So the show creators knew immediately just how much people loved Cass. And I do want to mention something. I mean, somebody would have to correct me on that, but I do think that the very first Destiel fic came out in under 48 hours after like Lazarus Rising. So, and like, I can't remember exactly, but I know that it's at the most 48 hours. And I kind of wanted to say that it was like just a few hours after, not gonna lie. So just saying that there you go. That Castiel was definitely a very loved character from the get-go. And I will sidestep any talk of his ending for a lot of reasons. So thank you so much, Shay, for this lovely voicemail.
And lastly, we have a voicemail today from Melanie.
Hey, Caring Wayward. My name's Melanie. And I just listened to the listener voicemail from Sam Interrupted. And I had a couple of comments on that one. So that listener, and you guys then specified about basically household violence with Dean, Sam, and John. And one thing I think that kind of came up a while ago when I started listening to you guys' podcast was I haven't heard anyone mention as of yet, and maybe it will come up later, that Sam is also a victim of child abuse and violence as well, if from the mere impact of he was probably there and he probably witnessed a lot of his older brother getting treated not so nicely by their father. And this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and why I had to take a break for a hot minute is because also coming from a household that experienced domestic violence and whatnot with my siblings, I wasn't necessarily the target like Sam was, but it is something that still has lasting impact that I am still going through at this point, because there are certain points when you see that as a child and not being able to do anything, such as for like a younger sibling, that you still have strong reactions to that kind of behavior. Like I have triggers now with people yelling and screaming because of that experience. And I think giving Sam the benefit of the doubt, at least in terms of his character on the show, leaves a little bit to be examined in that capacity. Well, thank you guys. I have not caught up to where you are yet. Keep on going. I love your podcasts. And thanks for having me.
Melanie, thank you so much for this voicemail. It's I mentioned a few weeks ago that I guested on a podcast called Supernatural Opinions, and the title of that particular episode that I guested on is The One Where There's No Peace When We Are Done. I think it's discussion number 17 or something if you're specifically looking for it. And I think I say what you're saying in this voicemail almost word for word, where I'm saying that one thing that I find this fandom does a lot is erase Sam's trauma. Because yes, of course, Dean took on, from what we know, Dean took on the beatings, Dean took on a lot of the immediate hardships of the abusive relationship with John, and he shielded Sam as much as he possibly could from that. However, Sam was still there, like you said, and he was also being shielded by a child not much older than he was, being raised by a child not much older than he was, and that in and of itself is neglectful, which is a form of abuse as well. Just so even if Sam hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything, he would still be. I would still consider him to be neglected and therefore abused by their father. I think a lot of the trauma that Dean has, Sam has as well, and I know that this is a bit of a sore topic for a lot of people, particularly on this side of the fandom, but that's something that more and more that I see all the time on the show, and that part of the reason for that is in the writing as well, right? Where like they'll talk about a particular trauma that one of them has, or particularly Dean has. And I'm like, Sam was there too, right? Like Sam was there too. And he also carries that with him, carries it differently, but he still carries it too. And I agree with you that I think we have to look at Sam with keeping that in mind, right? Because that's just the reality of domestic violence. So thank you so much for reminding us of that.
No, Melanie, thank you. This is a very heavy but important voicemail to share with us. I think, and like I'll put this on myself because I feel like before I had the time to really like learn how to read media, it's much easier to miss when the abuse isn't physically shown to you or having physical like bruising or injuries, to then look at someone else who's being abused in a different way and there isn't a physical mark of some sort to denote the suffering they've gone through, that without proper media literacy it can be missed completely or erased to the eyes of the viewer. And it really has taken studying media and doing a podcast like this and having these heavy and difficult and powerful conversations with listeners like yourself and Mary and other guests we've spoken to, and even just discussing the show, that abuse shows itself in so many different ways, and oftentimes those can be completely invisible. It's how many times have I worked with children. I was taught to like look for the signs of like abuse, like in case they're not talking about it, like how to see the signs. And like a lot of the stuff they taught us back then was the physical, if they're showing up with bruises or a black eye or their stories don't make sense, and like what they talk about. But like nothing really like trained you, or like there was no conversation around like the things that, looking back, there's definitely scenarios that, like, I wish I had known better. I was a child back then, so I couldn't have known. I didn't know enough. But like looking back at some of these people I've worked with, that like there were signs, but I didn't have the literacy to read them and pick up on them. And that is, I don't want to speak for you, Mary, but at least for me, a big part of why we do this show is to have these conversations, to bring this literacy to light for people who, whether they just need a place to talk about it and understand it and commiserate about it and connect with other people who understand it, or I hope that for some people it can also be education. The same way I learned so much doing this show and getting these messages and discussing these subjects, that there's people out there who might learn something. And I at the end of the day, I wish it didn't have to be that way. I wish no one had to listen to this and go like, oh shit, like I definitely know someone who was abused and I didn't understand until now, and it's way too long after the fact. But it is the reality of the world we live in, unfortunately. And while again, to go back to a previous message today, it's tough to say how much of this was the intended writing of the show. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter because it's a conversation we're able to have, and that's what really matters at the end of the day.
I also agree that I think this is why I love the voicemails so much, because they always bring points and thoughts and little tidbits of information that we just wouldn't be able to think of on our own, right? And so the reason why they're so interesting to me is just because we're able to kind of like take all of these little bits of information from everybody and kind of like put them all together as part of a bigger conversation.
No, I genuinely thank you, everyone who's written in, has had their voicemail on the show before, has sent one that we haven't gotten to yet, or just thank you in advance for anyone who's been inspired to send one in today, tomorrow, or down the road in a few seasons. We're ready for those voicemails and those messages, so thank you.
Speaking of which, can you remind people how they can send us a voicemail?
Yes, if you want to send us a message or a voicemail, go ahead and record it on your phone or any apparatus if you're choosing. I don't know why I keep making more complicated that I have to. But
most people register, most people do that on their phones, but absolutely, you're right.
you have an iPad. Do you want to? I'm sure Jeremy and Chris could tell you how to do it on your PS5 somehow. Whatever the case might be. Get that voicemail to us and get it on your computer and pop it over, or your phone, and pop it into an email to carryingwayward@gmail.com so that we may eventually get to it on one of our future episodes or future Angel Radios.
Now, Drew, during our hiatus, can you please remind people where they can find you on the internet?
Yep, I'm always available on Twitter @BoxlessThought, where I'll be sharing any of my upcoming projects. I've got a few little things in the work, but nothing to announce yet. Except for the big one, which is some upcoming live Gateleaper shows. And of course, by this point, I've posted a nice little thread, which I may even just pin to my account, because I think my current pin is super out of date. A list of episodes of Gateleapers I've done. So if you're craving a little bit of me and potentially being funny, it's a great spot to come listen to me and hear some very fun content. And Mary, what about you? Where can we find you?
I can be found on Twitter, unfortunately, @MaryTurner_. You can also find other of my podcasts. You can find my Our Flag Means Death podcast, The Gentleman Pirates Library. We have completed that one. And I am also in the process of recording a Hannibal podcast, if you're into that kind of deliciousness, called Rude Eats with Jeremy Greer from Monster of the Week. So, go look for that. That's on wherever you get podcasts, really, YouTube as well, apparently. And thank you so much for everybody who sent us some lovely voicemails for this episode. This was Carrying Wayward, a supernatural podcast produced by Rochelle Castellano, hosted by Drew Schulman and Marie Vigourou. Thank you to everyone supporting us on Ko-fi or Patreon, especially our bunker supporters, Elle, Jeremiah Thomas, and Simone. We'd also like to thank Jake Lionheart for our music and Jacqueline Tucci for additional sound editing. Head over to carryingwayward.com to become a patron or a Ko-fi subscriber, and for our merch store and our socials. And write us a review on Apple Podcasts. Carry on, our wayward friends.